Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new podcast on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And today we have a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a while, and we were finally able to make it happen a day like today because this man knows a lot about a topic that I don't know as much about, but that always been interested in, and that's radio in general, but specifically amateur radio, shortwave radio, and this strange thing that uh, we know as the numbers stations. He has a YouTube channel that I follow, and I have been following for a while, called Strange Beacons, and lives in the town of Naples, Florida, and he's joining us via telephone from there. Curt Rowlett. Curt, thanks for answering our call, and welcome to the Anton GF YouTube channel.
Well, hello there, Anton, and thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being here. I mentioned that you are interested in amateur radio and shortwave and number stations and anything to do with radio in general. And to begin the conversation, I was wondering, how did you begin this interest? How did you begin getting interested in, all of these topics that these days are not perhaps as popular as they once were?
Well, to try to give you the nutshell version of that, because I could tell you a very long story, but let's keep it short. I've always been interested in radio since I was a kid. And the story that I've been asked this question before, and the story that I tell is that an uncle once gave me an old shortwave radio. And instead of going to bed when I was supposed to at night, I'd be tuned into it, listening, and I would start hearing these really strange things coming over the radio that I had no idea what they were, and it intrigued me. And fast forward, I guess, to about 1996 or 7, something like that. I actually walked into I used to live in Seattle, Washington, lived there for just over 20 years. And I walked into a record store. Remember those? They used to have record stores.
They used to have them, yeah.
Yeah, I walked into a record store, and, it was typical those days that the clerks who worked in the shop would actually, play some music over the loudspeaker while you're browsing. They would usually choose what they wanted to play. And lo and behold, they actually had what is known as the Conet Project Cd Set playing. And what the Conet Project is a series of recordings of number stations and other strange radio oddities that this fellow named Joaquin Fernandez first recorded back in the 80s and 90s, and he put it together in this CD set. So I'm standing in there and I'm listening to these actual radio broadcasts. I'm going, what in the heck is this? And, browsing the records. So when I was going to go check out, I asked the clerk, and he's the one that told me what it was. So, like I said, fast forwarding from being a kid with my shortwave and then hearing this other weird shortwave thing that someone else had recorded, it really put the hook into me. That was 97, 98, something like that. So that was the beginning of the slippery slope that I eventually found myself on, and still sliding.
What did that beginning really mean? What did you do after that? How did you become interested in from listening to this kind of stuff over the radio to becoming an amateur radio enthusiast yourself and start working within that field?
Well, it's one of those things that for me it was incremental. I've always, over the years I've become a big computer person, and so I already had some knowledge of the electronics behind a computer. When you're connected to the internet, you're using a modem, which essentially came from the amateur radio community. The modem is actually what makes us allowed to connect to the internet, that sort of thing. And so I just started looking into this number station thing online to see if I could find anything there. And the more that I started to discover, the more I realized, hey, I've got to get myself another radio. So I got it. I went ahead and I purchased myself a little cheap shortwave radio and started trying to catch some of these strange stations myself. and actually got lucky and caught a few of them. And that just really put the hook into me again. At the time that I was first starting to look, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff out there. Very few people knew about the Conet project that I was telling you about, which was to use a $1 million word, it was one of the seminal moments where that was the beginning of what is now a really much larger interest in this kind of thing. It's all over the internet now. It's just sort of exploded on there. There were some other larger celebrities that actually sort of got the ball rolling. I mean, for instance, I forget the name of the band, but they actually used one of the Conet Project's recordings on one of their songs. Wound up getting sued by the Conet Project guy, by the way, for unauthorized use of his material, but that put it into the public eye. I had heard before that Steven Spielberg had actually got interested in it and was going around, you have to listen to this sort of deal. And the more it got rolled into some other movies, I think there was a Tom Cruise movie, Vanilla Sky or something like that, and they use a number station in that. And so pop culture started to grab hold of that. And, it just sort of, the more people became interested, the more showed up on the internet. So it became a lot easier to find that sort of stuff.
I think there's even a movie with Nicolas Cage that's called A Number Station or Number Stations or something like that.
No, that's actually John Cusack.
Oh, John Cusack. There you go. Not Nicolas Cage.
I love John Cusack, but I'll never forgive him for doing that movie. It's awful.
For whatever reason, I always get those two actors mixed up. John Cusack and Nicolas Cage.
Yeah, I know how that works. I've got that same problem with some other actors myself. But no, avoid that movie. It's terrible. There are plenty of other things that you can go and explore number stations, and that ain't one of them, as they say. So, and to kind of just, I don't want to, take over the whole conversation here, but sort of expand on what you were asking me about how I got into this. And I told you I bought a shortwave radio. One of the great innovations that came about as a result of the internet was they created something called software-defined radio. And essentially what that is a radio that is connected to a computer. Mm-hmm. And you can actually use your computer. You can dial into a software-defined radio. You can find them online for free. I run one myself, and I offered it up to the public for free. And you can go, and someone actually has an antenna hooked up to their software unit, and you can locally dial in a shortwave radio from your computer in a localized area. So as before, you had to have a really good hardware radio and a great antenna to be able to catch some of these stations that are really obscure, some of these strange number stations. Now all you have to do is go on the internet and find a software-defined radio that's located near where we suspect the station is located. For instance, there are a lot of number stations that come out of Russia and the whole Russian Federation of states that are there. So you can just go find a Kiwi SDR is what they're called, a software-defined radio. You find one in Moscow, and then you have the rough idea of what time the station's going to broadcast, and there you are. You're waiting to catch it. So
that's where technology comes in and helps us because. Having just a small receiver, it might be difficult to be able to tune into these stations. Although
depending on where you live, yeah.
That really is how I first heard of these stations. My grandmother had a shortwave receiver. It wasn't a great one. It wasn't a big one or anything like that, and she'd let me borrow it. Borrow is the word. In the end, I kept it for myself, and she never saw it again. But the thing is, when I was a kid, I was already very interested in languages, and I was trying to learn French and English and German. And so, purely by chance, I bumped into this thing called SW, or the shortwave. It had an SW on the receiver. And I started hearing strange languages that were not Spanish or English or anything like that. And I was just entranced by that because all of a sudden I could hear broadcasts in French or in other languages that, I'd never heard before, in Russian or whatever it was. But one night it was one of those number stations that somehow I came across. And of course, when you're 8, 9, 10 and you hear something like that, It's completely unexplainable. Sounds spooky. And
Exactly.
I just became really, first of all, I was a little bit afraid. And then I
Sure.
started trying to find more of those. And once in a while, I would find, purely by chance, I guess, some others. But then I forgot completely about that until several years later, when I was already in the United States and not in Europe, and just browsing on the internet, I found something that talked about number stations, and kind of
Mhm.
I wasn't looking for it really, but that kind of brought me back to myself as an 8 or 9 year old lying in bed at night with that shortwave receiver, and I made the connection. I said, this must be
Yeah.
what they were talking about.
Well, it
Um,
sounds like you and I had similar experiences then. I was a kid with a radio. You were the kid with a radio. You heard this weird
mhm.
thing later in life. You kind of heard another weird thing, and you're going, wait a second here.
And then I found also online a book called The Euro Numbers Mystery by Simon Mason. When
Oh,
I
yeah.
called you last night and we were talking briefly, I mentioned this book, and that book really kind of opened my eyes to this thing called the number stations that other people had been working on, and maybe not a lot of people, but at least I found some more information, some more specific, systematic information about it. And I must say that since then I have several shortwave receivers, none of them very good, because I basically use the shortwave to try to find stations that speak in different languages that I'm trying to learn and stuff like that. And I have not heard any more number stations on an actual receiver, but of course there are recordings, as you said, online, and then there's the SDRs that you very clearly explained just a few minutes ago.
Right.
So
If you're using a hardware radio, Anton, it's all about the antenna at that point because the cheapest radio, I mean, you can make a homemade radio, and if you have a great antenna, that's all it really matters. It's all about the antenna. Unless you're using software defined radio, then it kind of throws that out the window.
now we've been mentioning these number stations, and maybe there are people out there listening to our conversation, and they're not completely sure what it is that we're talking about. What is it about these number stations that's interesting, or what is a number stations? Could we just define a little bit what we are talking about when we mention number stations? What is a number station? Have they been around for a long time? Is that a new thing? What could you say about a number station to somebody that has never heard them?
You want to throw a couple of more questions in there? No, I'm just kidding you. Well, everything that you just asked is probably the most basic questions that everybody wants to know. I'm going to try to take it methodically. What you just said, they've been around since, as I've heard, as early as World War One that they were using number stations. Putting the cart before the horse here. What is the number station? Essentially, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a voice, either a male or a female voice, that suddenly pops up on a frequency, and they began reading out a series of numbers over the shortwave airwaves. Generally, the numbers that are read out are either in 4 or 5 number groups. For instance, it would be like 7, 2, 3, 6, 8, 7, 3, 2, 6, 8, or they could be in 4 number groups. To get even further in that, why the numbered groups like that? Well, they're believed to be transmitted or broadcasted by espionage groups. In other words, like the CIA in this country, the KGB, the former KGB in Russia, Mossad out of Israel. These intelligence agencies are using these 4 and 5 number groups because they have encrypted the message, sending out numbers plainly over the air. But what they're doing is they've encrypted these numbers. So somebody on the other end, the spy listening to the radio on the other end, because that's who the message is intended for, he's got it's known as a one-time pad. It's a type of encryption where he has the key to be able to decipher the numbers as they come over. And it's only used one time. For instance, they could be using a book. Let's just say it's Gone with the Wind. And when they start reading out the numbers, it tells him to go to page 22. And at the very top of page 22, he's going to count down 3 sentences. And then the second word in that third sentence is going to be the very first word of the message,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth. He can decrypt the entire stream of message numbers out, and at the end of that, what does he do? He tears that page out and destroys it, and it's never used again. So it's thought to be, it's called a one-time pad. It's thought to be an unbreakable form of a code, and it's quite simple. Why use this in the modern day of the internet, where there's a lot more efficient ways? Well, you can't trace that. Anybody that has a radio can hear the signal, and nobody knows. They might know who's broadcasting the signal, but they have no idea who it's intended for. It's usually intended for only one person. It might be out there broadcasting and hundreds of people are hearing it, thousands, but it's only meant for one person on the other end. It's the spy that's out there. So it's thought to be, these number stations are thought to be run by intelligence agencies. The beauty of it is anybody that has a radio can hear it. It's cheap, it's efficient, and it's untraceable. Nobody knows who the person was out there writing down those numbers and deciphering it. The internet leaves a trail. I don't care the best encryption, the best security. There are always breadcrumbs that are left, and that's the worst thing in the world that can happen for a spy, is if the breadcrumbs lead back to he or she. So that's it in a nutshell.
So
a very large nutshell.
Well, the interesting thing in here is that there's no possible traceability, and I think for if really the theory that we're dealing with spies here when it comes to number stations is the correct one, which most likely it is. There are a couple of things that occur to me. One of them is the messages can't be very long, because it's a simple system, but it's also kind of convoluted. If you have to send a bunch of numbers to get a person to decipher one word, for example, at a time, then the messages cannot be very long. But perhaps they don't need to be very long. And I think another thing that's interesting about this kind of communication is that in an age, 2020 is when we're recording this, of such technical development, it is older technologies that actually are more efficient for certain kinds of communication.
Exactly. That's what we're talking about here. I mean, the biggest thing, the worst thing that can happen to a spy is to be outed, because he or she is no longer has their covert anonymity anymore. It could be life-threatening as well if you're in a hostile country and you're spying for somebody. So, it's the worst thing that could possibly happen. And as long as someone doesn't catch you writing down the numbers and decoding it with your one-time pad, you're probably safe, and no one would ever be the wiser. So it's a highly efficient system in that way.
I had also read somewhere that there is evidence of number stations used for spying activities because of certain court cases where one-time pads actually surface. Is that right?
That is true. And I was earlier when we were talking about using simple, hardware radios and an antenna at your house to try to pick up a station. I was about to mention that there aren't really any number stations that can easily be picked up in North America, with the exception of one of them, and it's the station that comes out of Cuba. It's known as the HM01 hybrid number station. Before that, it was known as Atención, or attention in Spanish, of course. And it's still being transmitted today. Well, going back to what you're talking about, in the discovery of this, there was a group of Cubans. I believe there was 5. I think they were called the Cuban Five, and they were actually arrested here in the United States. And in their possession, they found materials that they were using to decipher these coded messages that were being transmitted over the radio from Cuba into the United States, into South Florida. So yeah, to answer your question, that is one of the cases. There's actually one or two more that I know of. I think one of them happened in Europe, and the details escape me now, but it's in probably one or two of the books that I've got on my shelf. But very few of them have ever been outed in the way that we're talking about it, what you're asking about. But the Cuban Five was one of them. Yeah.
Of course, there's complete silence about number stations from the different governments and states
Oh,
around the
they all,
world.
they
That
all disavow that they even exist. You know, I'd say going back to what they are is that for the longest time there were people that would banter around all kinds of explanations for what they were. I've heard, it's drug runners using a secret code. It's it's weird weather data being read out by an automated data system. It's space aliens. It's all of this different stuff. But the only thing, you use, what is it, Occam's razor? You use your logic to figure out, it's more than likely it's got to, we're talking about a very expensive, powerful transmitter that's going to be out there transmitting over, thousands of miles around the planet. It takes a little bit of money to do that. It takes a little bit of a setup to be able to you know, to broadcast that sort of thing. Drug dealers don't tend to really stay in one place and stick on that kind of a schedule. So it tends to fall into the laps of the intelligence agencies. And it's the answer that makes the most sense.
Now, if an important setup is needed for these broadcasts, then how can we explain the fact that we don't know who's running those setups? In the sense that couldn't the signal be triangulated in such a way that we could find out where exactly these broadcasts are coming from?
Absolutely. And what you just mentioned, triangulation, has been performed uh, numerous times on some of the better known stations that are out there. For instance, we haven't talked about this, but there are number stations that have been around for years and years and years, and there are some brand new ones that are out there now that they've been around for a few years. And over the history of some of these stations, they have done exactly what you just said. They've triangulated the signal using special radios and special antennas, and they've been able to locate where they think the broadcasting station is for some of these. For example, there's one that was broadcast out of Moscow. I don't want to use the wrong name for what the number station was, but let's just say there was a number station there, and they used triangulation to locate the transmitter site in Moscow. And the same thing has been done here in the United States. For a while, there was a number station being broadcast out of Virginia. It was affectionately known as Cynthia. It was a female voice. I've got some copies of it on my YouTube channel. It's a female voice reading out numbers, and because Cynthia has the letters CIA in it, it was affectionately known as Cynthia. And so there's a story. Actually, I think there's a book from my website. I've got a link to a book called Havana Moon, and he and another guy actually went out and triangulated it and discovered it was being transmitted from an Air Force base located somewhere in Virginia. So that's the answer to your question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, triangulation. And these days, with modern web SDRs, the software-defined radios we're talking about, they've got built-in software on these radios that allow you to triangulate where a signal is coming from. So you can do it with the internet and the computer now.
You're listening to the voice of Curt Rowlett, coming out of Naples, Florida. We're talking to him about one of his biggest hobbies, which is radio in general, and amateur radio in particular. And we're discussing number stations, which is a topic that's kind of mysterious, and because of that, personally interesting to me as it is to many other people. Now, when we talk about number stations, of course, not all of them broadcast in English, and not all of them broadcast with an actual human voice, right?
That's correct. They've got an automated, for want of a better term, a machine. And in the machine, you can program it to program the voice to speak out letters or numbers. Most of the time, it's only numbers, and a few of them can actually say words like "end," or whatever language it is. And you can go on YouTube and you can actually find several of these machines that are out there. The name of it is escaping me right now, but they transmit, they can program these numbers and they can turn it on to transmit at a certain time and use whatever language it is that the person on the other end would understand more readily.
Now, one of the languages that is used is Morse Code. Is this, again, it sounds like a technology that was invented long, long ago, but it's still being used in the 21st century for this kind of um, communication. Is there any advantage to using one or the other, Morse code versus actual voices with numbers?
Actually, there's a greater advantage in using Morse code if we're talking about what's known in the radio world as propagation. There are a lot of factors that affect how a signal over the radio waves can travel. Voice does not travel as easily as a Morse code signal does. You can actually, this is one of the things that's really well known and why Morse code is still around today. You can get in terrible, terrible band conditions, which is affected by the solar, the sun affects band conditions. And band conditions are what allows a signal to go, all the way around the entire planet in less than a second. I mean, they actually move at the speed of light. A voice being transmitted on the radio is more affected by bad or adverse conditions than a Morse code signal is. In the worst conditions, you can get a Morse code signal through when nothing else will get through. So it's the simplicity of this. It's a simple system, a series of dots and dashes that represent letters and numbers, and it can get through when other ones cannot. And trust me, there are still Morse code number stations that are transmitting probably right now as we're speaking. So I've recorded quite a few of them.
I'm sure you've been asked this question before, Curt, but it seems to me that, number stations have been around for a long time, probably longer than 100 years now, since you mentioned that they probably go back to World War I.
Right.
But one would think that there would be a decrease in the use of number stations after the Berlin Wall came down and after the USSR collapsed. This doesn't seem to be true. Can you find an explanation for that?
No, actually, I'm going to correct you a little bit. It actually is true what you just said. When the Berlin Wall fell, and essentially when the Cold War started to be, come to an end, a lot of these signals are that I was talking about earlier. There were some great ones that were around for years and years. They've disappeared and they're no longer around anymore. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, there was a big decrease, and there was an end to some of the quote-unquote historical stations. And over the years, some new ones have popped up to essentially sort of replace the ones that are gone now, but they're not nearly as numerous as they used to be.
Now, some of these stations probably have kept sort of the same kind of format. Maybe in some cases they have changed a little bit. I'm not sure. But one of the things that I've always found intriguing about these number stations is some of those sounds that sometimes precede the numbers, which could be music. That has helped the number station monitoring groups, and there are monitoring groups out there that are interested in monitoring, the frequency and, the days in which these stations that are still broadcasting broadcast. But there are stations, there are stations known as the Lincolnshire Poacher, for example, that doesn't exist anymore, magnetic fields and others that have names like that, and they had to do with actual music that could be heard.
Well, it was what is known, back in the golden days of radio. I mean, even when somebody, is above ground as NBC or CBS or something like that, where when they broadcast over the radio, they had what was known as an interval signal. And think of it as your favorite television show's theme song. When that theme song comes on, you instantly know that your favorite TV show is coming on. Well, they had these interval signals that represented CBS or NBC, and that was one of the what's the word I'm looking for? It was one of the traditions that they used when a radio station was about to come on. Well, interestingly enough, signals like the perfect one example that you just named was the Lincolnshire Poacher. It had a very distinct interval signal that played before the actual number station broadcast began. So you would hear that echoing over the radio late at night. And here's something else that you mentioned before. It can be kind of spooky. When I first found out about these things, and you dial one in, and you're sitting there in your dark house at night, you got your radio going, and you get this static and this fuzz, and shortwave has a bit of an echo, and all of a sudden here comes this spooky, creepy sounding little tune that comes out over the radio, and suddenly after the tune disappears, someone starts reading out these random numbers, and you're sitting there going, what in the heck is this? And so I'm kind of getting off the subject here a little bit, but going back to what you were saying, the interval signal itself seems to add a little something to it. And there aren't any stations that are quite like that anymore. There are one or two that are out there, but they're the exception rather than the rule these days.
And that has helped some of these monitoring groups to catalog and recognize these stations. When I'm talking about monitoring groups, and of course the internet has helped quite a bit with this since the advent of the internet, but what are we really talking about? What do these people, you belong to some of those, what do you all do regarding number stations monitoring?
Well, we're a group of radio nerds. And that's first and foremost. You got to be a radio nerd, and essentially, it's the same thing as anybody else that belongs to any other kind of group, like say on the internet or whatever. You're interested in the hobby. You monitor these stations and you report the information back to everybody else so that you can start cataloging these things. For instance, there's this one group known as Priom. They're a group of primarily a European number stations monitoring group. They have been monitoring these stations for so long and keeping great logs about the date, time, and the frequency where these have been transmitted that they can now predict when these stations are going to transmit. It's a huge help. So that's the kind of information they're getting. Hey, we heard so-and-so signal today and it transmitted on this frequency, and that is a known frequency and a known time, so that verifies it. Or you can get some more even important information. Hey, there's a brand new signal that we caught and it transmitted. We're going to start monitoring that frequency at this date and time and see if we can hear it again, because that might be a brand new station. Because as you well can guess, these spy groups that are doing this, they don't advertise it like, hey, there's a brand new show coming on this week.
New numbers coming on this week, right?
So, yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying is it's an exchange of information for people who are interested in this sort of thing. And you kind of write the history of it. You write the book, so to speak.
Do these stations transmit on several different frequencies at the same time, or is this not done?
Maybe not at the same time, but for example, there's this one, going back to Priom again, they've given a lot of these stations an official designation to keep them all separate from each other. This one is known as the E07 number station. It's called the Englishman because it uses an automated voice and a male voice that speaks with an English accent. And for example, if you go onto the Priom schedule and you look at it, it'll be scheduled, say, for like, this is typical of one, it'll be scheduled for 4 broadcasts, each of them happening 10 minutes apart, and all 4 of them on different frequencies. So let's just say it's starting up at 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock a.m., and then it will broadcast until 1:10, and then at 1:10 it'll switch over to another frequency, broadcast, at 1:10, and then at 1:20 it'll switch to another one, and so forth. And there are numerous reasons why that's done. Number one reason is that, one frequency might be propagating better than another one. For example, if you went on to 10 megahertz, it might have so much static and so much interference that nobody could hear anything. And then you have to shift down to the 40 meter band, which is, 7 megahertz. And you go down there, so that way it's redundancy. You want the message to get through. You're using a technology that's really susceptible to interference, so you use redundancy. You send the same exact message out 4 different times on 4 frequencies, and you're almost guaranteed that the message is going to get through. So, yeah.
Now, going back to your YouTube channel, which is entitled Strange Beacons, it is clear that when you are out there looking for different stations on the shortwave, it is not only number stations that one can find, but there are also other things that, for lack of a better term, we know as oddities, right? And
Exactly.
beacons and stuff like that. What exactly are these beacons that you can hear on the shortwave? Because they sound different. It's not the same thing, but they might be used for the same purpose, maybe.
Well, you're asking the $1 million question there, Anton. I mean, number one is a lot of times you'll hear these strange beacons, and you don't know what it is, and so you'll note the time that you heard it, the frequency that you heard it on, and you'll start monitoring it and see if you can notice some sort of pattern and try to figure out exactly what it is. If it's in Morse code, then generally something transmitted in a Morse code will send out something in that's spelling out some letters or something like that. If it's in a digital mode, it's using something like, don't want to throw too many things out that are over your head, but like PSK31 and RTTY or radio teletype, then there are software programs you can use to decipher that and see if there's an actual message coming through, that sort of thing. Some of these oddities that you find out there, they may pop up once and you get something really strange and you never hear it again. Some of them are out there and they appear over and over again, and we still don't know what they are. There's this one that's known as XM Wales, or the backwards music station.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the strangest signals that anyone, I think, has ever heard on the radio, and nobody really has a clue exactly what it is, but it used to transmit quite regularly on several different known frequencies. I've called it a couple of times myself and recorded it. But it sounds like something off of the most incredible Pink Floyd album you've ever heard. I mean, it's just, so kind of going off of what you asked me. But yes, there are things that aren't number stations that are of interest to these groups, and they're out there looking for them all the time. Any kind of weird signal that might be out there, and you try to identify what it is, and just kind of go from there. It just sort of grabs you and draws you in.
There's also one that I think it's pretty famous, which is known as UVB76. UVB76, although maybe that's not the right way to refer to it.
You got it right. It's also known as the buzzer.
The buzzer. And basically all it is just a buzz that repeats itself on and on 24/7, right?
Yeah. It's on 4625 kilohertz. It's been there for years and years and years. It has changed very little over the number of years it's been there. The sound has changed a little bit here and there, but essentially it's just buzzing over and over again. There are a lot of theories about what it's doing there. The most commonly accepted theory is that it's simply there to occupy that particular frequency. It's known to be transmitted out of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And think about it like this. If you've got, I'm going to be showing my age here, but back when I was growing up, you used to have telephones that had what were known as party lines,
mm-hmm.
which means you shared a connection with several other people. And if you wanted to talk on it and you got on there and someone's on there, well, guess what? You can't talk. Well, essentially, that's what UVB76 is thought to be doing. It's sitting there buzzing over and over again, essentially jamming that particular frequency. So no one's going to go on and try to use that frequency because you're not going to be able to hear anybody over this horrible buzzing noise that's going on. So it sits there until it's needed. The interesting thing about UVB76 is every now and then it'll stop buzzing, and then a Russian voice will come out and read out a cryptic message. And there's thought to be either spies or the Russian military that's using it. There are a lot of fanciful theories that have popped up about exactly what it is that they're doing with that. But that's a really good example of one of the oddities that's out there.
Now
the Russians seem to have quite a few of those, actually.
Well, you seem, that's why I was wondering what happened after the Cold War was supposed to be over with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR. And you very rightly mentioned that there has been a decrease, but of course these stations are still there, some of them, and some of them have been there for a long time. And I think that you touch upon something that's very interesting, which is not necessarily that buzzing sound like that forever, but the moment when something different happens, right? And that seems to attract the attention, of course, understandably, of the people who are monitoring these stations, which is when some sort of faulty situation seems to happen. Can you give some examples besides that of any sort of faulty situation where something happened that was maybe not expected to happen? Because these monitors, these people who are monitoring like you do, you find a certain kind of recurrence of stations and messages and numbers and buzzing sounds and tones, but sometimes there's a malfunction of some kind, and that makes this station all the more interesting for it, right?
Exactly. Well, it can either be human or hardware malfunctions. For instance, going back to UVB 76, there are people who have been monitoring that before and they've recorded it, and suddenly they would hear someone drop something on the floor. It's thought to be that the buzzer essentially is some sort of buzzing device that's sitting in front of a microphone that's transmitting 24/7. And then someone walks into the room and drops a plate on the floor. They've actually heard that. They've heard people getting into arguments back there going, "What are you doing, Ivan?" That sort of thing. Another one is there's this other station. I think it was EO7 again. I'd have to go look up on my channel. There's so many of them that they drop out of my head. They're known to be kind of sloppy at times, and they're using computers to transmit these numbers as well. The voices, and every now and then you'll hear them boot up a Windows XP system. There's been a guy, actually, there was this one station, and he's sitting there waiting to transmit. They transmit generally on the hour, on the half hour, and they can actually hear this guy. They hear him boot up the computer over the open frequency. And he's sitting there playing Spider Solitaire on his computer. You can hear all the little dings and stuff that are going on. So it's interesting because here are these spy stations that, conceivably could be sending out, very nefarious orders to a spy in the field. Go blow up the bridge, or the assassination is going forward. And it puts like a really kind of a human face on this. There's some guy bored at his job playing Spider Solitaire waiting to send out this spy message, so.
Well, they may be spies, but they're still people. So, they do what normal people do.
you got it. It's not all James Bond, the James Bond world, right? Although we kind of wish it was, but,
Now, several times you've mentioned some ways of cataloging and referring to these stations like EO8 or EO7 or EO3. This has to do, I think, with the Conet project that you were talking about before, right? How are these stations cataloged? According to language, according to the kind of supposed messages that they're sending? How is that done?
Yeah, well, they have actually the Conet project was not responsible for the labeling system that you're talking about so much as this group Prion that I was telling you about. There's another group called the Numbers and Oddities group. There's one called Enigma that I believe the Enigma group was the one that actually started out with this labeling system. And for instance, we talked about the EO7. Well, E stands for English. Let me see if I can find some of the other ones that are out here. There's the S11A. The S stands for Slavic. It's a Slavic type language. Let's see what else we got on.
So, for example, if they broadcast in Russian or in Czech, because those are Slavic languages, then that would be S.
That's exactly right. You'll see the S06S. You'll see the S06. S stands for it's in the Slavic language, and then the number is the designator. It's Slavic 07, Slavic 07B, because it's slightly different than the other one. But yeah, that's exactly what that's all about. And if you go on the Prion website, you can go in there, and they actually have a blog that'll kind of give you it'll tell you how the designation works. Actually, I'm looking at it right now. There's a station called G06, and it's G for the German language. V is for voice broadcast, M is for Morse code, F is for frequency, which generally is talking about a digital mode, and so forth and so on. HM, which is the one that comes out of Cuba, is known as a hybrid of a both an analog and a digital mode that goes together. Analog being voice and digital being computer generated. So yeah.
Now, I'm sorry to keep you on the number stations for so long, but it is a topic that I'm
That's
personally
fascinating, isn't it?
interested in, and it's really a fascinating topic to me. Even though I don't have a way to monitor anything, and I hardly ever have the time or even the equipment to listen to them. And probably if I did, my wife would think I'm crazy or something like that. But uh, but the truth is, mm, there are and there have been so many different number stations out there. That I wonder if there are any number stations that you enjoy particularly or that you like more than others for any specific reason.
I got asked that question the other day. I'm a big fan of Reddit, and I go onto Reddit. There are several communities on Reddit that follow exactly what we're talking about, shortwave oddities and number stations and all of that. And I got asked that question, and I came on and said, I like the English Man, the EO7. I mean, it's something about this person's voice, and this is what I mentioned the other day. Here's this voice that comes on. He sounds very kind of upbeat and happy. He's like, "Hi there, I'm going to read out some spy messages," and you're sitting there listening to this. He almost sounds like he could be selling you life insurance. And then it dawned on me. I was going, well, wait a minute. This guy could be sending out, it's time to fire up the nuclear missiles and shoot them at the United States. I mean, it kind of dawned on me. I like that station because I like those guys' styles, as it were, so to say. And it's very regular. It transmits all the time. And it's usually a very clear station. You can pull it in quite easily. So yeah, that's my favorite one. That's actually around today too. That's why another reason why I like it. You can go pull it in, whenever you want to go listen to it, pretty much.
You did an interview not too long ago with a low power station in Seattle, and that's how I got the idea to contact you and do the do this show, this conversation that we're having right now. And you mentioned one, and you also broadcast some examples of one that to me was absolutely out of this world, which was this station where a seemingly Chinese person was doing live voice Morse code. That to me is incredible. You would have machines to do that better than a person that goes dee da, over and over again.
That's exactly what he's doing. He was going dee dee da 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 dee dee da da da. It's like, and that one's only been heard, a few times. It's thought to be some form of the Chinese military that's training over the air that they're using it in case all the power goes out on the Morse code key or something. You can still communicate.
Well, I guess if you're a spy, you got to think about everything, right?
You do. You got every contingency's got to be there.
Put yourself in the worst possible situation. You listen to Curt Rowlett here on Anton GF, the YouTube channel. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. I'm coming over the YouTube, over the internet, and I'm in Jackson, Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And of course, Curt is an amateur radio enthusiast, and he works with this quite a bit. And it's a topic that I've always been interested in. And so, from number stations, and possibly we may go back to them at some point, but I would like to concentrate a little bit more on your work as an amateur radio person, in the sense that you operate some radio station of some kind. I assume from your own home, right?
Well, yeah, amateur radio is a hobby, and I was going to correct you on something. It's not work; it's a hobby.
Okay.
So yeah, essentially, if you are licensed as a radio in the amateur radio hobby, you're not allowed to make any kind of money off of it whatsoever. So that's one of the first things that happens. But yeah, after I listened for many years, and I was going, this is actually fascinating. I wonder what it's like to have a radio license and be able to kind of like, get out there and do some of this myself. And so studied and took the exam and got my first license. And from there was able to start diving in a little bit deeper, and decided that I needed to upgrade my license. And I went back and passed the second exam, and got bumped up a notch, because the higher your license is, the more privileges that you have. There are just so many people think of amateur radio as being one thing, but it's really not. There are so many, use $1 million word, there are so many niche areas of this. There's radio and just basic transmitting, but there are people who do all kinds of other things with this. For example, I'm really big into digital modes. That's using your computer to encode a message and you send it digitally out over the airwaves. It sounds a lot like, if you remember the days of dial-up modems.
Absolutely.
It sounds like I'm sitting there sending out a dial-up modem sound. It's traveling across the airwaves into someone else's radio, and it's coming back through their radio into their computer, and they're decoding it with the right software on the other end. So digital modes are a big thing for me. Other aspects of the hobby I got into recently, this is brand new for me. I started to do what's known as working satellites. You can get a cheap handheld radio and the correct antenna, and you can actually use an app on your smartphone and know when a satellite is going to be passing over your head, tune to the right frequency, aim your antenna in the right direction, and you can actually talk to other people who are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from you that are also connected to the satellite at the same time. Just did that a couple of weeks ago, and I actually talked to some people. Well, not talked to them, I was just listening. Heard some people down in in Puerto Rico, the southern part of the island of Puerto Rico. And you can also actually use the same setup to talk to the astronauts on the International Space Station, that kind of thing.
Well, that sounds really interesting. To tell you the truth, it's something that I hadn't even thought about, that would be something you could possibly do and use satellites in that way.
Yeah, and that's actually just the entry level. There are 3 licenses. There's a technician, general, and amateur extra. And the technician, the entry level license, immediately they come in and they've got privileges for all of the frequencies that you would need to talk to to use the satellites or talk to the International Space Station. So it's really neat that you can pass the test, which is fairly simple to do. I came into this hobby really knowing almost nothing about electronics, and you don't need to know as much in-depth detail about electronics as you would think you do. A lot of it's just common sense. Generally these days, if you're a smart computer user, you can probably pass the amateur radio exam.
Now, I've always said, Curt, to anybody that wanted to listen, that to me, the radio was always my preferred means of communication, in the sense that I like listening to the radio more than I do like watching TV in many cases. There are many reasons for that. One is the feeling that a voice coming over the airwaves gives you, which is different from the feeling of actually seeing somebody doing something and talking over the television, for example, or on a YouTube video or something like that. So ever since I was a little kid, I was really interested in radio, and not in the sense of my becoming knowledgeable about electronics or anything like that, because science has never been one of my strongest suits, and I was more of a, as they used to say back in those days, a humanities person, and that's why I'm a professor of Spanish and literature and stuff like that is one of my main hobbies. But the interesting thing that the radio has is that it's extremely portable, and you can really listen to it anywhere in a way that until the advent of the internet, the television wasn't as portable, right? And then it just makes you feel a different kind of feeling when it comes to listening to a radio show. Radio shows, at least the way they used to be many years ago. Now radio has changed so much over the past 30, 40 years, right? But sometimes when one listens to the old radio shows from the 30s, 40s, you realize how much the world has changed in less than a century. But I still enjoy listening to the radio. I still enjoy listening to old radio shows that you can find on the Internet Archive or something like that. But to you, Curt, what is specifically attractive about amateur radio, and is it an expensive hobby?
Well, What I was explaining to you a second ago about using the satellites is actually one of the least expensive areas of the hobby. It can be very expensive. Don't get me wrong. There are some very, very expensive radios out there. But for example, the radio that I use to communicate with satellites, I paid under $25 for it. Mm-hmm. The antenna that I use, you can actually build the antennas yourself for probably under $15. So you can spend as much as you want on it, but it's actually not as expensive as one would think it would be. The trouble with radio is that it's what I always refer to as the potato chip syndrome. You know how it is when you have one potato chip and suddenly you want the next one and the next one and the next one. Radio is a lot like that, and you will find yourself suddenly wanting as many radios as you can probably pack into your house, so.
But isn't that the way it is with all hobbies? Like you start listening to some record and then you want the next, or you buy a book and then you want more by the same author and that kind of thing.
That's exactly what we're talking about here. You get interested in it and it becomes mildly obsessive, I guess is the word.
I can understand that. Now, you mentioned some of the things that you do as part of your hobby, and that leads me to wonder if there are any uses of amateur radio that are important and that people are not aware of.
Yeah, the first thing that popped into my head a second ago when you started talking about why you found radio attractive and why you found it important, and the thing that I thought about was, well, we're very dependent these days on the internet and on the cell phone system for our communications. If you get a powerful enough natural emergency that comes through, whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that, when the internet gets knocked out, which is part of the infrastructure, and it tends to kind of go by the wayside in a bad enough natural emergency, or the cell phone towers get knocked out, you can take a radio and hook it up to your car battery and still be communicating with people over the airwaves. So it's not dependent so much on the infrastructure is what you make it. In other words, you get a 12-volt battery from your car and a simple handheld radio, and you can connect it up and keep it charged up, and you can still be communicating with people during the time of an emergency. And it's used all the time. Perfect example is, again, going back to Puerto Rico. Back when they got hit by the last hurricane, and even with the most recent earthquake they had down there, amateur radio operators stepped in to help with communications. Their infrastructure was knocked out, and amateur radio operators went down to Puerto Rico and were establishing telephone links back to the States for people who needed to call their loved ones, that sort of thing.
That's what I was thinking about as soon as you mentioned that, the idea that, if the infrastructure is kaput at some point, it's just completely disappears because of natural reasons or any other reasons, there are still ways to communicate with people if you know how. And exactly. I guess amateur radio gives you that know-how that, not a lot of people have. And that, could be very important in a situation like that, which unfortunately is bound to happen at some point. Yeah. Now, another thing...
Go ahead.
No, sorry, you can go ahead.
No, I was just going to throw in another example is for, there are technologies that you can use over the radio. You can actually send images over the radio waves. So, when their internet is down and their cell phone tower is down, I can still send cat videos to people, that sort of thing, if they needed it. I'm being silly, but I'm just saying that's the technology is there, and it's not dependent on the infrastructure that's here, and that's why I think it's so important,
And especially, as you mentioned before, we are now so dependent on the internet and on satellites and all of that we can't hardly get anywhere unless we have GPS, and I'm as guilty of that as the next person. I referee high school soccer in my free time, and when I go to a new stadium or a new site for refereeing a game in a place that I'd never been before, I guess in the past I would have needed to find my way around using a map and stop in a gas station or something like that. But now that's not necessary anymore. But, if your cell phone breaks down or if the internet's not working at that point, then you have to go back to whatever ways you have to communicate and get where you're going.
you fall back on primitive guys like me.
Now, when you talk about the shortwave radio band, as I said before, I've always been interested in it because of the opportunity that it used to give me, and it still does, to listen to broadcasts in languages that are just not widely spoken in the United States, like German or French, etc. Right?
Right.
But I have noticed, Curt, a huge decrease in the number of shortwave radio stations. I'm talking now about commercial radio stations, which I guess could be attributed to the advent of the internet. What is the if you can give us some information about this? What is the current state of shortwave radio, and what do you see as the future of shortwave radio in the next decades or so?
Well, the state of things will be easier to answer, and the future will be a little bit more difficult. The state of things is exactly as you just described it. The internet has pretty much eliminated commercial shortwave. Nowadays, I mean, I'm as guilty as the next person. I listen to podcasts that I download onto my phone all the time. So I'm not listening to a radio program anywhere. Even I think it's a real shame, actually, because like you say, I mean, some of the best cultural exchange that I've ever had in my young life was, dialing into a quote unquote foreign radio station and hearing their perspective on world events, that sort of thing. But sadly, like you say, it's starting to die. There are far, far fewer shortwave broadcasts than there used to be. Some of the countries that are still dependent on it because they don't have as much infrastructure as we're used to in the United States. Africa is a perfect example. Africa still has quite a lot of shortwave broadcasts that happen there in a number of different languages. And so they're a little bit more dependent on shortwave than, say, we are here in the United States. But yes, it is starting to really decline. The ones you asked the question about the future, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure about that. It would be really difficult for me to answer that. I'll put it to you this way. As long as I'm still alive, it's going to keep on going forward because I love radio. I love the things that it can do. I like the method of communication that it represents for all the reasons that we've talked about, up until, this point right now. And as long as I'm around, and a lot of people that I know that are interested in this hobby, it'll be around here for a while. So the future. And here's another great thing. When I was teaching classes, I taught amateur radio classes for several years. One of the best things that could happen in those classes is when the younger kids came in. We'd have kids in there. We had them as young as 8 and 9 years old coming in and getting their licenses. The great thing about it was how enthusiastic they were about it. And so to put it in sort of like, I know it sounds like I'm giving a patriotic speech, but the future was in the children, the future is in these kids. And so, yeah, that's, but as far as commercially goes, I have my doubts that shortwave will last very much longer into the commercial future, except for, again, those regions that are more dependent on it than, say, one that has, greater infrastructure like we do here that we're used to.
And the number of stations, of course.
Of course. Well, that's never going to stop. People are always going to try to be sneaky, right?
Well, another thing that I forgot to mention about radio is that, as much as I like the podcasts and I do them myself, I'm doing one right now to post on YouTube. When I was in Nashville and I was hosting my classic country music radio show there that I hosted for several years while I was a student at Vanderbilt University, I would play old country music, Ernest Stubb and Bob Wills and Patsy Cline and people that didn't get on the radio much anymore in Nashville in the early 2000s. Sometimes trying to bring some of those musicians who were still alive for interviews on the radio show in the studio. There was one thing, Curt, that I really can't quite put my finger on why this is the case. But there was very little that could compare every week to those 2 hours that I was in front of the microphone sharing music and experiences with people, real people who are actually listening out there and who could call the station and ask for a specific song or say, my grandfather played fiddle on that record, or something like that. There's something about the immediacy of radio that you just don't get anywhere else.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to sound like I'm showing my age, but there's something just about, you get a perfect podcast these days. It's made with top of the line digital equipment. You get clarity of sound. You get everything that's just absolutely perfect. And you know what? Some of the soul is out of there. There's something about listening to a radio when you get that little bit crackle and pop, just like listening to an old, vinyl record or something like that. There's something softer about the analog side of all of this. And, it's just something that will always appeal to me as a listener, for sure. I understand exactly what you're talking about. There's a certain amount of, for want of a better word, soul that's in radio that you're never going to put into a computer.
Well, once in a while, I would play 78s on that radio show as well.
Well, you really are old school.
Well, some of those songs were never reissued on CD or even on 33 RPM albums. So,
like Hank Snow or somebody.
Hank Snow, there you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm moving on, and I don't hurt anymore. I know those great songs. Now, one thing that I saw on your on your YouTube channel, Strange Beacons, which I recommend to everyone out there if you don't know it already, if you're interested in radio and number stations and all those strange beacons we've been talking about. Once in a while, Curt, you seem to bump into pirate radio stations here in the United States. And
absolutely.
I'm wondering about that because I know that in the history of music, pirate radio was very important, going back to Radio Luxembourg, who would play the Beatles when other stations wouldn't play the Beatles, and, Wolfman Jag and all those guys, I'm wondering, is pirate radio still alive in the United States? And what kind of broadcasts do you hear that are actually not licensed by the FCC?
Well, to answer your first question, yes, I actually listened to one last weekend. They tend to kind of, if you know where to listen, where to look, and where to listen on the radio, and you're at the right time, they tend to pop up either on like holidays like Halloween or New Year's or Christmas, or on the weekends like Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. As a licensed radio amateur, and the fact that pirate radio is against the FCC rules, I'm supposed to sit here and tell you that it's highly illegal and no one should be doing this. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But there's something about a really well-run pirate radio station that goes to all the things that you and I have been talking about soul, you name it, before, that really just sort of grabs you. And to answer your question, they play a wide variety of music on there. The best ones come on and actually they keep their talk to a minimum. They don't use any foul language. They're just there to play music. Every now and then they'll interdisperse something in there. Some of them even transmit digital images out that you can decode over your computer while they're broadcasting, that sort of thing. So you know that there are probably radio amateurs themselves that are out there doing it. But there's quite a few of them out there still. There actually are several different monitoring groups who do nothing but monitor for and listen for pirate radio as well.
No, I'm not trying.
Don't do it at home, kids, because it's highly illegal. And the FCC, serious, they just wrote a brand new law, and they're really cracking down on this sort of thing now. So,
well, that kind of speaks to my next question. Actually, I'm not trying to foster pirate radio in any way. Of course, don't do it. There's other things that you can do that are, less dangerous to your liberty, I guess, than that. And I'm wondering,
that are legal.
but the question is, I know they're illegal, but is it really something really risky to put it in on the air? This kind of pirate radio station. I mean, can you go to jail for that? Would you be paying fines for it? I mean, is it a really serious offense?
As far as the seriousness of it, I don't think I've ever heard anybody go to jail for pirate radio. More than likely what will happen is the FCC would find out where you're broadcasting from. If they can figure that out, through triangulation again, they more than likely would come and confiscate your equipment. And in some cases, if you're a repeat offender, then they might slap on a fine, depending on it. The biggest thing about radio pirates is, here's the deal. We in amateur radio, they set aside all of these frequencies in there so that we don't bump into each other. We're not causing interference with each other. So if someone is broadcasting on a particular frequency that's, let's just say it's interfering with an emergency frequency for EMTs or the police, that would be a really terrible thing, and it would probably really jump down hard on the person doing it. But if you're a pirate that goes out to an obscure frequency that you don't ever hear anything on, and that's where they're broadcasting that, that's a little bit different. But to go to your question, it's more or less they would confiscate equipment and slap you with a hefty fine.
You're listening to Curt Rowlett coming loud and clear over the telephone, not shortwave radio or any other medium like that.
We're cheating.
Yeah, that's right. I wish we could do it in a different way, but like I said, I don't have any sort of equipment of that kind to do it. But he's in Naples, Florida, and he's a shortwave, an amateur radio enthusiast, and we're talking today about number stations, about amateur radio, about shortwave radio. And as we're winding down this really interesting conversation, I know you have other things to do today than talk to me about radio, although I know this is your hobby and you enjoy it, and I do too. It's been a really interesting conversation, but I still have a couple of more questions. One of them regards your YouTube channel, which is called Strange Beacons, and you can find it on YouTube. I've been following it for a while, and really enjoy listening to the videos that you have there and watching them, although it's more listening than watching, really. And sometimes I have no idea what it is that I'm listening to or hearing, but it's a really interesting channel. I love going on there, and I'm wondering, why did you begin this YouTube channel? What is the purpose of the YouTube channel? And have you been able to communicate through that channel with other people that have similar interests?
Yeah, the reason why I started is the same reason why, I was telling you before about the radio nerds that get together and they compare information, they keep logs, and they start kind of like writing the history of what's going on in this hobby. I saw this as a way of recording, what I was seeing and hearing, because you're actually, you're seeing things. I'm using software-defined radio, so you can actually see the signals that are being transmitted. So I felt to myself, well, I'm going to start saving a lot of these, and I'll just upload them to a YouTube channel, and that way I'll have a historical record of it. Turns out there are several other people that are actually on YouTube as well that are doing the exact same thing, and I got inspiration from looking at their channels, and pretty much just as a record, if I could put it to you that way. It's as a record of what's going on now and what transpired before, if that makes sense.
Now, if you were to describe your channel to somebody that has never been on there and has never seen it, what kind of content do you have in there?
Well, I've got I'm really interested in any kind of oddities or mysteries that are related to radio, television, computers, any kind of communications that are out there. There are all kind of strange things that have been recorded. For instance, telephone, going back to old school analog telephone, there was a whole group of people called the phone freakers that took over the telephone system and made it do some things that it was never designed to do. I've got videos that discuss the telephone freaking stuff. I've got videos that have recorded of some really unusual telephone calls that have been recorded. I've got things that are, for instance, there have been television hacks in the past. People have actually taken over television channels and broadcast, right in the middle of the 9 o'clock news. Just anything odd that happens like that, I'm there to kind of grab it. Primarily, it's radio. When you come looking for my channel, you're going to see that probably 80% of the content is about radio and what I see and hear on radio.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you follow other channels that are sort of similar. Are there any that you could mention that you could recommend to people out there that are sort of kind of follow the same philosophy of your own channel? Yeah,
sure. Probably the biggest inspiration to me is a channel called First Token, and that's FIRSTTOKEN. And this guy he's probably got more content than I do on mine, and he is I don't want to discuss too much about this person because he's got his privacy and all of that. I don't want to say too much about him, but I do know that he is an extraordinarily gifted and very smart radio radio expert. He knows more about radio than I will ever forget. So, he has great radio equipment. He captures some really odd stuff that you'll hear on the airwaves. It's really worth a look going to his channel and exploring his content. Another one is a lady named Mary Johnson, and her channel is called Mary Johnson Shortwave. She does the same thing that I'm doing. She's out monitoring the air bands, and she's recording what she hears, and she uploads her content too. There are a couple of other channels, but most of them aren't as prolific in their posting as First Token and Mary Johnson are. They tend to upload videos more often. I've kind of slacked off on the amount of videos that I've been uploading lately because I've been so busy with other things. But yeah, those are two of them that I would recommend.
Do you do your own recordings, or do you find material from other sources as well?
Primarily do my own recordings. I'm actually firing up the software-defined radio on my computer. I go and dial in the frequency, and I sit there and wait to see what happens, and the whole time I'm recording it. I've also gone and found some historical sound files that I thought were interesting of world events that have been recorded in the past, and I've created videos using those sound files. And so if you go in and, for instance, you go in and check out my channel, I've got a lot of playlists in there. Of course, I've got one's called Number Stations and Oddities of Shortwave, and that's where I put anything in there that's related to those. Got one for pirate radio. I've got one for, let's see here. I've got one for phone freaking. I've got one for hackers and hacking and computers and the internet, that sort of thing. And I'm also interested in vintage computing, so I've got some vintage computing videos uploaded, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your website. Could you give us the URL for it so people can go and check it out?
Sure. It's called Labyrinth 13, and I'll spell that. It's LABYRINTH, the number 1, the number 3.com. So it's labyrinth13.com. And that's where I've got links to everything that I upload to social media from there. My Twitter account, YouTube, I use SoundCloud, that sort of thing. Also got a link there to my software-defined radio that's free for anybody that wants to get into this hobby. You can click on that and start dialing in through the short waves. Oh,
that's very interesting for sure. So it's a good place to check out and get started on this hobby that really is important to you and to many other people. Now, as a final question, Curt, I'd like to know if you could very succinctly, very briefly explain how somebody that is not an amateur radio operator or doesn't know much about amateur radio but is interested in it, how could you get started in amateur radio? How can you get licensed so that you're not a pirate radio operator like we mentioned before? Is that a difficult thing to do? Does it take time, money? Let us know a little bit about that.
All. Not at all difficult. The biggest thing is it depends on where you live. If you live near a large metropolitan city, I can almost guarantee that you'll have a radio group that's local to you. And most of them do like I used to do when I was involved with teaching radio classes. They they have a schedule and they will teach classes. Generally, they try to teach like 2 weekends in a row, and at the end of the last class, they'll give you the exam. But it's really worth your time. Most of them are free to go to. They don't charge you anything to go and study, and I think it only costs like $5 or $10 to take the exam. You cannot go wrong with that. You can go on the internet and you can type in amateur radio clubs near me, amateur radio licensing near me, and it'll pop up. It'll show you the closest place where you can go and attend a class and study and get your license.
Well, that sounds easy enough, but I wonder if it becomes a little bit more difficult if you live in a rural area, not too close to a big city like Nashville or Memphis or in Tennessee. I suppose you could just try to study that stuff on your own.
Yeah, there are plenty of, and that's absolutely correct. I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you do live in a rural area and there's nothing close within a reasonable driving distance, And yeah, there are numerous websites that you can go to, and they actually have practice exams on there that you can go and take the practice exams. There are also courses that you can find online that are free courses. The cool thing about the licensing exam itself is the FAA is required by law to release the entire question and answer pool to the general public. So we know the exact questions that they're going to ask, and we know the exact answers. And so if you're good at study and memorization, you will be able to have that to your advantage as well. So yeah, to answer your question, you can go online and study this on your own, and just find a place that's given the class. The one thing you might have to do is actually drive to the class and go take the exam. I don't think anybody offers it online.
Well, Curt, thank you so much for spending this, over 80 minutes already chatting about amateur radio and shortwave radio and these mysterious number stations that are still out there, and all the monitoring groups and the pirate radio and all of that we've been discussing for the last 80-some minutes. It really has been a pleasure chatting with you. I've wanted to do this interview for quite a while, and I really appreciate your answering our call and being on. I could say it's not exactly, or in a way, I guess it is on the air here with us on the Anton GF YouTube channel.
Well, Anton, I appreciate it. I'm really happy that you've got an interest in this, and it's my pleasure to talk to you about it. And stay in touch. Keep checking my channel. If anything weird pops up and you got to talk to me about it, call me back.
Well, I definitely will, and I encourage everyone to do the same. The YouTube channel is called Strange Beacons, and you'll find a lot of oddities and strange sounds there, and lots of interesting information if you're interested in this kind of field and this kind of hobby. Curt Rowlett knows a lot about it, and the station, well, not the station, but the YouTube channel is called Strange Beacons, and I really recommend it to everybody out there. Thanks again, Curt, and hope to talk to you again really, really soon.
My pleasure, Anton, and take care.
This has been a conversation with Curt Rowlett, shortwave and amateur radio enthusiast that has a great YouTube channel called Strange Beacons that I encourage everyone out there to check out. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you over Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. Mine is the copyright of this podcast, year 2020, recorded live in Jackson, Tennessee, and it'll be available very soon on the Anton GF YouTube channel. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for listening, and so long, everybody.